My name is David Harper. I'm 35 years old, living in Savannah, Georgia, with my wife, Charlotte, who's 32. Charlotte works as a seamstress, running a small boutique in town. We've been married for 8 years, and while I often travel for business, our relationship has always seemed solid until that fateful night in Chicago. I had been on yet another business trip, this time to the north. I didn't tell Charlotte where exactly I was heading, not to keep anything from her, but because my travel schedule had become so routine. Charlotte had mentioned a girls' weekend with her friends, something she did regularly. This time, it was a bachelorette-style trip across a few cities. I never gave it a second thought. She loved her adventures with the girls, and I trusted her completely. Or so I thought. It was a crisp Friday evening, and I had just wrapped up a successful business dinner at one of Chicago's best restaurants. The meeting went better than I'd hoped, and I was feeling pretty good. As I stood to shake hands with my colleagues, a familiar figure outside the window caught my eye. It was Charlotte. At first, I convinced myself I was seeing things. She was supposed to be miles away, out with her friends on their getaway. But there she was, dressed to kill, laughing and walking arm in arm with her best friend, Lauren. What really hit me hard was that they weren't alone. 2 men flanked them, and it didn't take much to see these weren't just friends. The way one of them had his hand on Charlotte's waist, the way they laughed so intimately, it was all too much. My heart dropped. After hastily excusing myself from the dinner, I slipped out through the restaurant's side entrance and followed them, keeping a safe distance. The street was busy enough to hide my presence, but I stayed close enough to catch bits of their conversation. Charlotte was talking to her companion with a tone I hadn't heard in years of flirtatious, carefree excitement. My mind raced. How long had this been going on? I tailed them down a few blocks until they entered a boutique hotel. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I stood there, frozen, watching the door they disappeared into, the cold air biting at my face. Part of me wanted to confront them right there, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. I needed proof, something undeniable. So, I did what I never thought I'd have to do. I checked into the same hotel, requesting a room on a floor just above theirs. Once I got to my room, the rush of emotions hit me like a wave. Anger, confusion, betrayal, it was all too much to process. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the hotel keycard in my hand, wondering how everything could unravel so quickly. Was this really happening? Charlotte, my wife, the woman I'd built a life with, was down the hall with another man. The weight of it was unbearable. After pacing the room for what felt like hours, I knew I had to be strategic. An impulsive confrontation would only lead to a heated argument, maybe even tears. No, I needed something bigger, something that would not only expose her betrayal but also show Charlotte exactly what it felt like to be blindsided. I left my room, quietly making my way down to their floor. I could hear faint laughter and music from behind the door. My stomach churned at the sound of Charlotte's voice. It was the same laugh she used with me, once a sign of joy, now twisted into something else. I pulled out my phone and started recording, capturing the hotel door number and the sounds leaking out from their room. I stood there for a minute, gathering evidence that would prove everything. The recording was a small step, but it was the beginning of something bigger. I had to know how deep the betrayal went. As I went back to my room, I contacted a private investigator I'd met through work. I explained the situation, and within the hour, he was on board. I wanted the truth, the entire truth, not just what I had seen that night. I needed to know if this affair had been happening for months, or even years. By the time I hung up the phone, a plan started to form in my mind. Confronting Charlotte in the heat of the moment was too easy. What I wanted was something more profound, a slow, steady unraveling that would hit her when she least expected it. The first part of my revenge was simple but effective. Our finances. Charlotte was blissfully unaware that I handled all the money in our relationship. She had access to her personal accounts, but I controlled everything else. By the next morning, I'd quietly moved funds, ensuring that any shared assets were locked down. She wouldn't notice immediately, but soon enough, she'd feel the pressure. And when she did, she'd come to me, confused and desperate for answers. That's when the real game would begin. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel before Charlotte even stirred. I left Chicago without a word, already laying the groundwork for what would come next. I needed to be careful, methodical. There was no room for error. As the train sped south toward Savannah, I stared out the window, replaying the events of the night before in my mind. This wasn't just a one-off mistake. I could feel it in my gut. When I got home, I went straight to my office and reviewed the information the investigator had already pulled together. It didn't take long for him to confirm my worst suspicions. Charlotte had been meeting different men for months, always when I was away on business trips, always with the same lies about girls' weekends or boutique networking events. She had built a double life, one that I had been blind to while I worked to give her everything she wanted. The investigator compiled dates, times, locations, and even photos. It was all their undeniable proof that Charlotte had been living a lie for at least a year. The men changed, but the story was always the same. What hurt the most was how effortlessly she had deceived me. The Charlotte I thought I knew had been nothing but a mask. As I pieced together the timeline, I could feel my anger growing, but I knew I had to stay focused. There was no room for rage now, only strategy. The next step was setting up the financial trap. Charlotte would never see it coming. Over the course of the next few days, I transferred the bulk of our savings into accounts she couldn't touch. The house, the cars, everything we owned together. I made sure it was all in my name, or locked away under legal layers Charlotte couldn't reach. She had no idea, but she was already losing everything. Meanwhile, I continued to play the role of the loving husband. When she came home from her girls' trip, I greeted her as I always did, hiding my disgust behind a smile. She kissed me like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just spent a weekend betraying me. "Did you have fun?" I asked, my voice calm and steady. "Oh, just the usual," she replied, with a light laugh that made my skin crawl. "The girls were wild, as always." I nodded, pretending to laugh along, but inside, I was seething. She was lying straight to my face, and I was letting her, at least for now. In the following days, Charlotte began to notice small changes. Her credit cards were suddenly declined when she tried to shop online, and transfers from our joint account were mysteriously blocked. I could see the confusion growing in her eyes, but she hadn't confronted me yet. She had no idea that everything around her was about to crumble. That was just the beginning of what I had in store. A few weeks passed, and Charlotte grew more frustrated by the day. Her carefree attitude began to crack as she realized something was wrong. She'd ask me casually, "David, did you change something with the bank? My card isn't working." I played dumb, shrugging it off as some minor issue, all the while knowing that I had already pulled the strings. Then came the day I had been waiting for, the day everything started to unravel for her. It was a Friday evening, and Charlotte came home from her boutique with a deep frown etched on her face. I could tell she'd had a rough day. No sales, perhaps, or more likely, the credit problems had caught up with her. She sat down at the kitchen table, looking distracted, her eyes darting between her phone and the table, trying to figure out why her once privileged life was suddenly spiraling out of control. "David, we need to talk," she finally said, her voice strained. I took a seat across from her, keeping my face neutral. "What's up?" "I don't know what's going on with the bank, but none of my cards are working. And I just got a call from the mortgage company saying that payments haven't gone through for 2 months. What's happening?" I leaned back in my chair, feigning surprise. "That's strange. I'll look into it." She stared at me, her frustration turning into something more urgent. "David, this isn't funny. I can't access any of our accounts. Did you do something?" And there it was, the first crack. The first moment she realized something wasn't right. I could see the flicker of panic in her eyes, and it took every ounce of self-control not to let a smile break through. "Charlotte," I said calmly, "I think it's time we had a serious talk." Her expression shifted. She sat up straighter, her fingers nervously tapping the table. "What do you mean?" I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, pulling out the folder I had prepared. I'd been waiting for this moment, for when Charlotte would be forced to face the truth she had been hiding from. I set the folder on the table in front of her, watching her confusion deepen. "What's this?" she asked, eyeing the folder suspiciously. "Open it," I said quietly. Her fingers trembled slightly as she undid the clasp and began flipping through the contents, photos of her with other men, screenshots of messages, and hotel receipts. Her face drained of color as she realized what she was looking at. She flipped faster, her breathing quickening. There was no escaping it now. David, I can explain, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, my calm exterior giving way to the cold fury I had been holding back. Explain? How do you explain cheating on your husband for over a year? How do you explain lying to my face every time you said you were going out with the girls? Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't move me. Not anymore. I made a mistake, she choked out, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I love you, David. Love me? I laughed bitterly, standing up and pacing the kitchen. Is that what you call love? Sneaking around with strangers while I'm away, building a life with someone who's too stupid to see it? She broke down, sobbing into her hands. The woman who once seemed so composed, so put together, was now crumbling before me. But I wasn't going to stop. Not yet. I reached into the folder and pulled out the final piece of my plan. The divorce papers. I've already spoken to my lawyer, I said, my voice cutting through her sobs. These are the divorce papers. You'll sign them, or I'll make sure every single person in this town knows what you've done. Your friends, your clients, everyone. Her tear-streaked face looked up at me, shock and disbelief mingling with fear. David, please, we can fix this. We can work it out. I set the papers down in front of her. No, Charlotte. There's nothing left to fix. Sign the papers. You're not getting a cent, and you're going to walk out of this with nothing. She stared at the papers, her hands trembling as she reached for the pen. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in her life as she knew it was over. With each stroke of the pen, my revenge became complete. Charlotte was going to lose everything, and all I had to do was wait for it to fall apart. Charlotte signed the papers, but the numb look on her face told me that she hadn't fully grasped how much her life had just changed. I watched her, every detail of her crumbling composure searing itself into my memory. This was the moment I had been building toward, the moment her lies came crashing down. But as much as I had anticipated it, the satisfaction I felt was cold, hollow even. There was no joy, just a sense of finality. For the next few days, Charlotte was a ghost in our house. She didn't speak much, her usually confident demeanor replaced by a quiet desperation. She didn't know what to do, and I wasn't going to guide her through it. She was on her own now, and she knew it. But the real fallout began when word started to spread. I didn't need to lift a finger. Our small, tight-knit community did that for me. Savannah may be a charming, picturesque place to live, but it's also a town where rumors fly like wildfire, and secrets rarely stay hidden for long. All it took was one phone call to a local journalist who covered society news, the type who loved to sink their teeth into a scandal, especially one involving a prominent figure like Charlotte. The article appeared subtly at first, just a short piece about a beloved local boutique owner going through a tough divorce, but the real kicker came with the mention of an affair that rocked her marriage. It was vague enough to keep things discreet, but enough to set the town buzzing. People began whispering in coffee shops, exchanging knowing glances in the boutiques Charlotte used to frequent. The phone at her boutique stopped ringing. Clients canceled their appointments, and foot traffic slowed to a trickle. I could see it was only a matter of time before her business collapsed entirely. That was part of the plan. Charlotte had poured her heart into that boutique, building her reputation as a respected businesswoman in Savannah. Taking that away from her would cut deeper than anything else. She tried to salvage it, of course. I saw her making desperate phone calls, sending emails late into the night, trying to reassure her clients that everything was fine. But the damage was done. Her name had become synonymous with scandal, and in our town, that was a death sentence for any small business. The final blow came when her closest friends began to distance themselves. Lauren, her supposed best friend, was the first to pull away. I could tell Charlotte was devastated by that betrayal. She had confided in Lauren, shared her secrets, and now even her friend wanted nothing to do with her. One by one, her social circle evaporated, leaving her with nothing but the cold reality of what she had done. And then came the moment I had been waiting for, the moment she realized there was no going back. It was late one evening when she finally approached me, her eyes red from crying, her face pale and drawn. David, I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I've lost everything. I don't know what to do. I looked at her, feeling none of the sympathy she was clearly hoping for. I warned you, Charlotte. You did this to yourself. She nodded, unable to argue. But the boutique. I can't lose it, David. It's all I have left. I felt a brief pang of something pity, maybe, but it vanished as quickly as it came. You should have thought about that before you threw everything away. She stared at me for a long moment, as if waiting for some hint of compassion, some sign that I might help her. But there was nothing left to say. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. The next morning, Charlotte packed her things and left the house. I didn't watch her go, but I felt the quiet weight of her absence. It was over. Finally, completely over. After Charlotte left, the house was eerily quiet, but the silence didn't bring the peace I thought it would. I spent the next few days processing the fallout, replaying every moment of our confrontation in my head. There was a satisfaction, yes, but it wasn't as sweet as I'd imagined. The revenge I had meticulously planned and executed had hit its mark. Charlotte had lost everything, her reputation in tatters, her boutique collapsing. But what did I gain? I was alone, standing among the ruins of our life together. At first, I tried to bury myself in work. My travel schedule picked back up, giving me an excuse to avoid thinking too much about what had happened. But when I returned home each time, the house felt emptier than before. Charlotte's things were gone, but her presence still lingered, like a ghost haunting every corner. The kitchen where we used to talk, the living room where we laughed, it all felt hollow now. One evening, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of legal papers. The divorce was in motion, and I had gained everything I wanted from it financially. I was secure, and I had ensured that Charlotte walked away with almost nothing. Yet, as I looked at the documents, I realized that winning the battle didn't feel like winning at all. The phone rang, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was my private investigator. I hadn't expected to hear from him again, especially after everything had come to light, but his tone was different this time. David, he began, there's something else you need to know. I sat up, my heart pounding. What is it? He hesitated, as if unsure of how to break the news. It's about the man Charlotte was with in Chicago. He's married, has been for almost a decade. I thought you'd want to know. My grip tightened on the phone. This wasn't entirely surprising, but it added a new layer to the betrayal. Someone else's marriage was tangled up in this mess, and they were just as oblivious as I had been. I thought about the man's wife. Did she know? Was she living in the same ignorance I had once been, blissfully unaware of the lies unraveling behind her back? I asked for her name. It wasn't hard to find her online, a few searches, and there she was. Rebecca, married to the man who had wrapped his arms around my wife in the streets of Chicago. They had children, a life not so different from the one I had imagined for myself and Charlotte. For a moment, I sat there, staring at Rebecca's picture on my laptop screen, wondering what to do. I could let it go, walk away from this disaster, and focus on moving forward. But something inside me shifted. Wasn't she owed the same truth I had uncovered? Shouldn't she know what her husband had done? I made my decision quickly. I wasn't doing this out of spite, but out of a strange sense of justice. I couldn't sit by knowing someone else was living in the same darkness I had escaped. I drafted an anonymous letter, attaching the photos from the hotel that showed her husband with Charlotte. No details, no explanation, just the evidence she needed to see. A few days later, I mailed it, my heart heavy but resolute. What she did with the information was up to her, but at least she would know the truth. As the days passed, something unexpected happened. I began to feel lighter, as if the weight of the past was slowly lifting. The house no longer felt like a prison, and the memories of Charlotte, once so sharp, started to blur at the edges. My revenge had been thorough, but it wasn't the cold, calculated victory that brought me closure. It was something quieter, letting go. I hadn't just been seeking revenge on Charlotte. I realized I had been trying to reclaim something, my dignity, my sense of control. But in the end, I learned that the real healing came not from destroying her, but from freeing myself from the anger and betrayal that had consumed me. I wasn't that man anymore. And now, I could finally begin to move forward. Weeks turned into months, and life started to settle into a new kind of normal. Charlotte was gone, her presence fading from my daily life like a distant echo. The divorce finalized without much fuss. She had no fight left in her by the end. Her boutique closed down quietly, the once bustling business now just a shuttered building in Savannah's historic district. I heard through the grapevine that she moved out of town, likely trying to start over somewhere far from the whispers that followed her everywhere. As for me, the initial sting of betrayal and the bitter satisfaction of revenge began to dissolve into something else. Clarity. I spent more time focusing on myself, reconnecting with old friends, and picking up hobbies I had long ignored. I started going for early morning runs along the river, breathing in the cool air as the sun rose over Savannah. For the first time in years, I was doing things because I wanted to, not because they were expected of me or part of some routine. It was during one of these runs that I met Rachel. She was sitting on a bench near the river, sipping coffee and watching the water. There was something serene about her presence, and I found myself stopping, out of breath but smiling. She smiled back, and we started talking. What began as a brief exchange about the beauty of the river at dawn slowly turned into something more. Days turned into weeks, and soon enough, we were meeting regularly, her laughter filling the silence that had once haunted me. Rachel was different from Charlotte in every way. She was grounded, genuine, and there were no games, no hidden agendas. We shared stories about life, love, and loss, and for the first time, I felt like I was really being seen. No masks, no walls. One afternoon, over coffee, I opened up about my marriage to Charlotte, about the betrayal, the revenge, and everything that had happened. I half expected Rachel to look at me differently after hearing the story, but instead, she listened quietly, her eyes full of understanding. "You did what you had to do, David," she said softly. "Sometimes people don't realize how much they hurt others until it's too late. And sometimes they never do." Her words lingered with me, and it dawned on me that I hadn't just gotten revenge on Charlotte. I had freed myself from a life of lies and half-truths, and now I had a chance to build something real, not out of anger or vengeance, but out of genuine love and trust. In the months that followed, I continued to move forward. The house, which had once felt so empty, began to feel like home again. I redecorated, rearranged things, making it mine in a way it had never been before. Rachel and I grew closer, and though I was careful not to rush into anything, I couldn't help but feel that life was offering me a second chance. As for Charlotte, I didn't hear from her again after the divorce. I didn't need to. Whatever path she was on, it was hers to walk. I had no more bitterness left for her, just a quiet acceptance that we had both been broken in different ways, and we had each paid the price for it. Looking back on everything, I realized that the lesson wasn't just about revenge or betrayal. It was about self-worth. I had allowed myself to be blind to the cracks in my marriage because I didn't want to face the truth. But facing that truth, no matter how painful, had set me free. One evening, as Rachel and I sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the river, she turned to me and asked, "Do you regret any of it?" I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "No, I needed to go through it to get here." She smiled, understanding without needing to say more. The path that had once seemed dark and full of pain had led me to something brighter than I ever expected. Discover more stories. Subscribe today.